Illinois makes history yet again by abolishing the death penalty this week. That's up next on Capitol View. Hi, and thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Capitol View, the show where we talk about Illinois politics and government. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues magazine, and with me today is Jim Leach, News and Program Director with WMAY Radio in Springfield. Jim, thanks for coming.
Thank you, Jamey.
Kevin McDermott, State House reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Kevin, thanks for being here.
Jamey.
And Charlie Wheeler, the Director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at UIS and a longtime State House reporter. Charlie, thanks for coming.
My pleasure.
And of course, the big topic of the day today is the abolition of the death penalty, which took place this week. Governor Quinn signed the bill after a little bit of a false start.
Right.
Let's start off there.
Yeah,
Kevin, can you
word
walk
went
us through
out
this?
across the board that he was going to do this on Friday at Northwestern University, which is kind of the cradle of the anti-death penalty movement in this state. Late Thursday afternoon, word went out again that it wasn't going to happen. Nobody's saying this out of the administration, but there happened to be a little, we'll call it a sex scandal out of Northwestern University that day.
An educational sex scandal.
Yes, an educational sex scandal. We'll just leave it at that. But there's a lot of connecting of the dots and the assumption that the governor didn't want to have his big moment paired with that one. He ultimately did it on Monday and did it in more of a quiet manner. It was he signed it in a private ceremony and then announced the signature afterward. Still not exactly sure why they went from a ceremony to a private signing, and he sort of denied during the signing that was actually what had happened, but there's a lot of indications that maybe they had decided to try not to draw so much attention to this, which maybe was a little naive given the nature of this story. I mean, it's a huge story.
Yeah, it was kind of expected. Lots of people have been working on this issue for years and years. People have spent their lives working on this issue. It was really expected that there would be a lot of fanfare, a lot of people speaking and the like, and that didn't really happen. So.
Well, maybe the decision to kind of tone it down and not have a huge circus reflected what would you say, some empathy for the feelings of a lot of the survivors' families who had met with Quinn, urged him to veto the bill. And he perhaps thought it would have been inappropriate to have too much fanfare in the light of the still raw open wounds that these families are feeling because of what happened to their loved ones.
And Charlie, you've been watching this issue for quite a while. Can you take us a little bit through how we got to this point and why this might have been the right moment for this in Illinois?
Yeah, I actually was covering the legislature for the Sun-Times when the death penalty was reinstated in Illinois in the mid-1970s. And at that time, the argument was based on the lines, are there people who do things that are so horrible that they should be executed? And the decision, relatively easy decision for most legislators, because the bill passed fairly overwhelmingly, was yes, there are. And one of the people who voted yes in the House was then State Representative George Ryan. Over time, though, the debate shifted because of the problems that we encountered in Illinois with the death penalty. And the debate moved away from the question, should people like serial killer John Wayne Gacy be executed, as he was, to do we want to run the risk of executing someone who is innocent? And we've had 20 people on death row who were exonerated because they didn't do it. And so under the circumstances, George Ryan, after actually allowing the last execution in Illinois to go forward in 1999, he declared a moratorium on the death penalty. He said he would not allow any other executions on his watch. In the last few days before he left office, he commuted the death sentences of everyone on death row to life in prison. There were several people who he exonerated based on innocence at the time. Since then, 15 people have been sentenced to death, but the argument, as I say, shifted, and it was, can we ensure that we won't put someone to death who is innocent? And the conclusion reached by the majority of the members of the General Assembly was, no, we really can't do that. We can't design a system that is going to be infallible. And for the, what would you say, for the righteousness of executing the John Wayne Gacy's, we don't want to have to pay the price of perhaps someday executing someone who is innocent.
And yet at the same time, it was still so politically sensitive that they couldn't do it till after the election in a lame duck session.
Right.
And Pat Quinn campaigned all fall that he was a supporter of the death penalty, didn't really hint at being open to a repeal of it. And then, of course, the bill passed after the election, and then just a few months later, then Pat Quinn signs the legislation. Politically still very touchy, though, and you could certainly question whether or not Pat Quinn, who had a narrow victory in November, if he had campaigned all fall saying, I'm going to repeal the death penalty, could he have won? I mean, the polls, I think, have shifted somewhat, but still, I think a majority of Illinoisans were in favor of the death penalty.
Yeah, and I think most people weren't sure how he would act on this. You know, there was a big question hanging over it. No one knew when this passed, like, Quinn will definitely sign this.
No, I mean, he said over and over, I'm a death penalty supporter. He raised the same concerns that were raised by Ryan, raised by Blagojevich, and said he'd maintain the moratorium because of those concerns, but never really came out and said, I would sign a repeal of the death penalty if that bill gets to me. Well,
and this had become an issue that I think politicians on both sides just wanted out from under this thing. I mean, it was almost a no-win situation for them at this point to reinstate it in any way, which I think is why the moratorium stayed in place for as long as it did. And there's another point. Frequently on big issues like this, there's a question as to whether it's really over. I mean, already we have legislation out there that would reinstate the death penalty. I have the sense in this case it really is over. I think we're a non-death penalty state now. I think in a month nobody's going to be talking about this, and I'm basing that on the behavior of the prosecutors around the state, who are the only ones left who still have the ability to hold Quinn's feet to the fire with these pending cases. The law goes into effect July 1st. Any death sentence handed down before that technically is still valid. Quinn has said he's going to step in and commute all of those. This gives prosecutors the option to say, okay, we're going to go ahead and follow through on these and make you do that and keep this issue alive. It seems to me if this battle's still in play, that would be the logical front line, and it's not happening. None of them are doing that, the ones that we've talked to. They're throwing in the towel on this.
Was anyone surprised that he commuted all these sentences in one fell swoop along with the bill?
It seemed like the best way to put the thing to rest. I mean, those 15 that were on death row were going to be a problem because here we could be in a situation of being a non-death penalty state but still having people facing execution because obviously this would happen before the law had gone into effect. It seemed like the cleanest way to do it. In New Mexico, they still have 2, I think, death row inmates who are sitting here facing execution, even though New Mexico is now a non-death penalty state, and it's causing all kinds of arguments about the consistency of the law there.
Well, kind of intriguing, though, in the governor, in explaining his rationale for signing the repeal, talked about the inconsistency, the bias in these death penalty cases. In some ways, it sounded like it was sort of an indictment of the criminal justice system overall. 102 counties, 102 states' attorneys, differing approaches to all of this. You could make the same argument about any murder case, any major felony case. He didn't really talk in this announcement about wanting to seek any sort of reform or trying to address those issues. So on the one hand, you've taken care of the death penalty problem, but if indeed you think there's inconsistency and bias in the criminal justice system, it seems like that would cry out for attention too. We're not hearing that from Pat Quinn.
Well, I would argue the difference is the injustice, if you will, or the mistakes, as you uncover them, you can kind of remedy them if somebody is sitting in Stateville or Menard. Once someone's been executed and you discover it's a mistake, it's a lot harder to go back and undo what's done.
But the level of
and you talk
scrutiny,
about the inconsistency. As a matter of fact, the final person executed in Illinois was a guy named Andrew Cocorellis. He was a member of a sort of modern-day Jack the Ripper gang. 4 guys who went around, targeted women that they believed to be prostitutes, kidnapped the women, did unspeakable things to them, and ultimately murdered them after torture, mutilation, and a lot of horrible stuff. Cocorellis was a mope in this group. He was an underling. The guy who was the mastermind, a guy named Robin Gecht, the guy who drove the van, the guy who pointed out, that's the woman we want, the guy who read the satanic incantations at these rituals, for want of a better term, he's in Menard. If he lives long enough, he'll walk out as a free man. If you go to the Department of Corrections website, they have the date on which he's to be released. Now, he'll be in his 90s, but even so, he was the brains behind the operation. He didn't get the death penalty. This mope gets the death penalty and is executed. One of the other conspirators got life in prison. The fourth guy was sentenced to death. It was commuted by Ryan before he left to life in prison. So in that sense, there is a certain injustice, and that may be one of the issues that's motivated people who are against the death penalty.
Mm-hmm. And part of the disparities that lawmakers have referred to were found by a report that Ryan commissioned, saying that the death penalty is often sought in cases in more rural areas, or when victims are, you know, a member of the community that people get upset about, or often with white victims over black victims. So it's not necessarily who gets convicted, it's who they seek that penalty with. Whereas if someone commits a murder in Cook County, they're far less likely to get sentenced to death as they would in a central Illinois community where the town is really outraged and putting a lot of pressure on prosecutors to look for seeking the death penalty. So moving ahead, we're not expecting this to become a huge issue in the future, though, Kevin? You think this is kind of...
I don't know. Maybe there's other views, but I think it's over.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, I think it's settled down. There'll be people who will raise it as campaign issues against those people who voted for it, but I don't see Illinois going back and reinstating the death penalty.
And the only way it even becomes a major issue again is if there is, heaven forbid, at some point, a very notorious murder case, a very notorious killer, another John Wayne Gacy that shows up. Then it may reignite at that point, and hopefully that never happens. But until then, I think it is probably dead, and most politicians at this point would just assume leave it alone.
Leave it that way.
Yeah, and I would say the fact that a lot of the lawmakers that came out in support of it this time around actually said, I've changed my mind since when I first came into the legislature. You know, I used to be pro-death penalty, now I'm against it. It seems like they feel like it's a safe place to change their view, or at least publicly change their view. So let's move on to some budget things that have come up this week. The Senate Republicans came out today saying Quinn's budget is not cutting nearly enough for us to avoid big deficits in the future. They're looking for maybe $4 to $6 billion in cuts in the next fiscal year. First of all, these cuts seem just huge. And second of all, where would they come from?
And I wasn't paying close attention, I guess, because I really didn't hear when the Republicans delineated chapter and verse exactly where they were going to find this money. Were you guys paying closer attention?
I don't know that they have.
No, they plan to spell out where the cuts would come from next week, but just looking at the cuts that have already been made, I don't know where $4 to $6 billion could come from.
Well, if you decided you weren't going to send any state money to local schools, that would solve the problem. Are they thinking about doing that, maybe?
I'm not sure. They're looking. They said everything is on the table, as they've always said. But this seems to be their first move, at least, to say, here's what we think needs to be done, and we are going to present some alternative to Quinn, which is it's a new thing.
It's easy to put out a number. It's a lot harder to say, here are the people who are going to be denied services.
Well, and an illustrative example is just here in Springfield in the last few weeks, we've had the state pull out of the National High School Finals Rodeo. Every couple of years comes back to Springfield. The state has a relatively modest investment of a few $100,000 to help bring this here and to help staff the facilities, and they said we can't afford that anymore. We don't get enough return on it. It brings in a big local return on investment, not a big return to the state. They said no, you have Republican lawmakers here crying bloody murder about that and wanting that money reinstated. Again, that's a few $100,000. When you multiply that by $4 to $6 million, you can see the challenges they're going to be facing.
Yeah, that got tons of local press coverage, at least.
Well, and there is a pattern that we've talked about before here, in that this part of the way that the governor and others are approaching this is to put not really to eliminate this debt, not really to stop services, but to push the debt onto the locals, to push the problem onto the locals. Another example is cutting funding for local school buses. I mean, that's something that Quinn's proposing, and obviously we're still going to need school buses. They're just not going to pay for them anymore, so guess who's going to pay for them? It's going to be the local districts, and ultimately it's going to be the taxpayers in the local districts. So this notion that we can cut expenses and we can do this without raising taxes, frequently, depending on the issue, they may in fact be just pushing tax hikes down to the local level and making people there deal with it.
Well, it seems like the big difference this time around is the Republicans are saying when they come out with their cuts, they're going to be willing to put some votes on these cuts. They're promising at least, I think, 14 to 15 votes on each proposal. So they're, to some degree, putting their money where their mouth is, more so than they have in the past. But would cuts of this magnitude even fly in a democratically controlled Senate? I mean, what do you think of this, Charlie?
I just don't see how you can make cuts of that magnitude without severely impacting services. And I said facetiously eliminating all the money for schools. that's not going to happen. It's not that the state throws its money around helter-skelter, and I've used this analogy before. There's not some guy in the basement of the state capitol shoveling $100 bills into the furnace. Most of the money that the state spends from its general fund, something like 90%, goes to education, human services, public safety. Do we want to reduce the amount of money we're sending local schools? Kevin, you mentioned the transportation. What did Quinn want to cut out of transportation? 50 million or something like that?
But it was.
And it will have an impact, particularly with the cost of fuel rising. It's going to cost more for the school buses to take kids to school. Somebody's got to pay for it. You know, the local fuel dealers aren't going to say, oh yeah, for the school, here, we'll fill up your bus with diesel for free. It's not going to happen. So that is going to have an impact. If you decide, as we already have, to reduce the eligibility for Medicaid, some people who were eligible for this state, federal health insurance program no longer will have that coverage. Medicaid is a huge expenditure. It's something like $7–8 billion in general funds. One area where you could raise some money, and I suspect this will be part of the Republican plan, is asking retired state employees to pay for their health insurance or pay some of it. But that's not $6 billion. So I just don't see where you're going to come up with cuts that are going to win not just the approval from the Democrats, but from a lot of Republicans, because they're going to gore local oxes.
And you know, in the House, I mean, we've just gotten through an election. They start filing again at the end of this year. The Illinois Policy Institute, a conservative think tank, had their own draft budget proposal this week, talked about cutting millions and millions of dollars out of things like public health on the premise that, for example, cancer is not a communicable disease, so it's not really a, quote, public health issue. Anybody want to have their name on a bill that slashes funding for services for cancer patients going into an election year? I doubt it, seriously.
Well, the Republicans' argument, a lot of it is, we just voted for a tax increase and now you're asking us for billions in borrowing, and we're just not comfortable with that until you spell out some big cuts. I mean, is that a valid argument?
You know, Charlie's point is a good one. This notion that, that, as you put it, there's somebody in the basement shoveling dollar bills, or every time you hear one of these politicians say, well, what we need to do is a, what do they call it, a forensic audit, which is sort of a made-up term in terms of how they're using it. The implication there is that there's some mystery as to how the money is being spent. There's no mystery as to how the money is being spent. For the most part, the money is being spent the way people want it spent. We're in an economic downturn, and that's the main reason that we're broke. I mean, if you know, if the economy was doing better and everybody was able to pay taxes the way that they always have in the past, that's really the only thing that's going to solve this ultimately. I always get the feeling with some of these proposals that they're sort of treading water until the economy comes back around. That's really the only thing that's going to pull them out of this. $6 billion in cuts, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, and the borrowing is to pay off bills that we've already accrued for services we've already purchased for which we don't have the cash. And the argument is it's better to borrow from the people who are in the business of lending money, the Wall Street guys, than to borrow from your local service provider who is not in the banking business and is struggling to meet his or her own payroll, pay the overhead for their business, and the state is stiffing them.
And the tax increase argument for Republicans to make, well, let's stiff the small businesses that are having to carry this.
Yeah, and the tax increase is to kind of adjust the revenues coming in going forward to the commitments that the people expect to be made to pay for services. The borrowing is to pay for stuff we've already enjoyed, so to speak, services and goods we've already received, but which we don't have the cash to pay for. And then part of the income tax increase is designated to pay off the cost of the borrowing over time.
The Republicans argue that we could pay off that borrowing solely with the income tax increase and without the borrowing. They haven't really presented exactly how that would happen, but is that a possibility, Charlie?
Well, sure. I mean, you could say, okay, we're bringing in these billions in new revenue. We'll just use them to pay our past bills, and we won't use them to pay for the current services, and then we'll just run up another set of billions of dollars of bills we owe, but the bills will be more current than ones that are 8–10 months old.
So it'll be swapping old debt for new debt, basically.
Yeah. I really think the problem is, as I suggested before, and as Kevin said, people think that there's a lot of money being wasted out there. Now, I've used before the definition that waste is any government program from which I personally don't get a benefit. And maybe that's the attitude of people. You know, I'm a senior citizen, so I'm not interested necessarily in what happens to schools. That's not true because I have grandkids. But let's say if I didn't have, why should I care about what happens to schools? Or I don't go to Southern Illinois very often. I go down to Carbondale to the school once a year to recruit students for the program. So what do I care whether there are any parks in Southern Illinois, whether the roads turn to mush other than the road I have to take to get to Carbondale? But you can't have that kind of an attitude and have society work. You have to realize we're a state, we're all in this together. The needs of the CTA are important in Chicago, just as the needs of good infrastructure are important in Southern Illinois. And I think people just have to understand that instead of having this kind of narrow view, I only care about mine.
Well, the Republicans do have a point of being critical of Quinn when it comes to cuts. He seems to propose big, flashy cuts and then pull back on them within a week or two. The most recent one being Human Services. He proposed some cuts for this fiscal year, and it looks like he's rolled back on those. How are we going to find a place to cut if every cut that gets put out there instantly gets pulled back because of the backlash and
that's
the
part of
upset?
a broader theme that goes beyond the budget and has to do with Pat Quinn's governing style. He has this tendency to sort of, put up trial balloons, or I don't even know if I call them that because I think they're frequently real policy when he proposes them and gets a little pushback, and suddenly he's scaling back or going in the other direction. It does make it a little difficult to predict what's going to happen next, because even when he seems solid and firm on something, that's not always the case. I mean, this is a governor who not that long ago vetoed his own ethics bill. Let's keep that in mind. I mean, this is something that, certainly comes into it when you're talking about how we're going to solve this problem and whose ox is going to get gored, to use the old cliche.
Well, another issue that's been around for a long time, but it looks like there might be a little more political appetite for it lately, is the concealed carry bill. Kevin, I feel like every time you're on, we talk about guns, but
yeah,
this is a
I'm
big
not
issue
packing,
right now.
I swear I'm not. Yeah, we, Charlie and I sort of debated this a little earlier. We see this every year. It's kind of perennial that the gun lobby pushes this. Illinois is one of only 2 states that doesn't currently allow people to walk around with concealed weapons, and the other state, Wisconsin, allows them to walk around with open weapons in a holster. So we're really the only state that doesn't allow you to walk around with a gun. This has made us a focal point nationally of the NRA and others who say, we're living in the past in their view. This comes up every year, and in the past it usually doesn't get very far. Sometimes you get to the floor, frequently you don't. This year they've already passed this out of committee this week, and the sense out there, at least among the pro-gun people, and I'm sensing also among the anti-gun people, is that this could be the year that this happens. And there's a couple of factors. The main factor is 2 U.S. Supreme Court cases, which involved didn't directly address the issue of concealed carry, but in a more general sense confirmed this notion that the Second Amendment does in fact guarantee personal ownership of guns and personal protection, and that there are limits to what a city can do in regulating that. The pro-gun people are extrapolating that out into the concealed carry realm. And in addition to that, we have a slightly more conservative legislature these days.
Jim, what are you hearing from listeners on this?
Certainly in the realm of talk radio, concealed carry is very important. It is the holy grail of issues, and it's something that people feel very strongly about. The reality is that obviously it hasn't gotten very far over the years. And one thing I'm not really sure on, because I haven't followed it that closely, is the fact that with Richie Daley leaving in Chicago, Rahm Emanuel coming in as mayor, how much does that impact this? Because certainly Richard Daley, very strong on gun control issues and wanted to have a lot of gun control. With a new Chicago mayor sort of calling the shots from City Hall up there, how does that play into this?
It's a good question. You may know better than I do how Rahm
honestly
Emanuel
don't know
will,
what,
but I mean, it's clear that Daley has been one of the, if not the major impediment to this over the years. And
well, if something like this were to pass, Chicago could go from having a handgun ban to concealed carry in the span of a year or two, which would be pretty drastic for the city, it seems.
I think part of it is it really is a regional thing, as we've talked about before. If you live downstate, if you live in a rural area and you think guns, you think deer hunting, you think duck hunting. If you live in Chicago and you think guns, you think about gangbangers driving by in the neighborhood and shooting and killing some innocent 4-year-old girl. And that's the reality. Those are the perceptions, and that colors people's attitudes towards this.
Yeah.
Interesting backdrop, too, that while this is going on, you've also got a big issue that's arisen out of the Attorney General in the recent ruling that says that the records of FOID card holders are public record and those names can be released to the press. Gun owners, gun rights activists see this as a real assault on their privacy and on their gun rights, and they're making that a huge issue and going after Attorney General Lisa Madigan directly on this, blaming her for this. I mean, I've heard a number of them say she's trying to grab our guns, this is part of her liberal anti-gun stance, and they're really trying to use this to whip things up.
Mm-hmm. And maybe a little conspiracy theory going on with
this. And again, they're going after her as opposed to going after the law as it's currently written, because certainly her ruling is based upon current open records laws, the FOIA, and what it allows and what's exempt and what's not exempt. It doesn't seem like this is something that's part of her personal agenda, but they're painting it that way.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't her ruling that the identity of the person, the name of the person had to be made public, but no other information?
Correct. Just the names.
No address. And so I'm not sure how this really gives, you hear the talk about, well, the criminals know just where to go shopping for their guns. So if Lisa Madigan's ruling results in the state police saying there's somebody named Charles Wheeler who has a firearm owner's identification card somewhere in the state of Illinois, I don't see how that helps.
You'd have to be a very enterprising burglar to make use of that, I would think.
Yeah.
Well,
and supposing your name was John Smith.
Well, and there always has been a never give an inch sort of strategy among the pro-gun lobby. I mean, essentially they have in the past gone to the mat over things that seem incremental, but to them are part of a slippery slope. I have to wonder if maybe they're keep taking their eye off the ball here. I mean, if this is in fact the year they're going to get concealed carry, I don't know. If I was one of their strategists, I'd probably tell them don't go off on this side issue that could take you away from the main debate.
Well, we'll have to end it at that. Thank you for tuning in to this week's show. I'd like to thank my guests, Jim Leach, Kevin McDermott, and Charlie Wheeler for joining us. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues Magazine, and tune in next week for more updates on what's going on in Illinois politics.